We all should have seen this knockout. Joaquin Buckley produced one of the best knockouts in UFC history in October of 2020 against Impa Kasanganay. But his career goes a lot deeper than just one kick. He's been through some of the lowest lows in the UFC and he's now come through it to being on the verge of a title shot. So how has Joaquin Buckley changed his career around? Buckley made his professional debut in 2014 and he signed to his first major promotion in 2016 in Bellator. He went 3 wins and 2 losses in that promotion, including his first professional defeat at the hands of Joaquin in the first round by knockout. Buckley had quite an unremarkable record outside the UFC, also losing a unanimous decision to Logan Story. He soon left Bellator to sign to the LFA, which is usually a good gateway promotion before fighters join the UFC. He happened to be matched up versus Joaquin, the man who handed Buckley his first professional defeat, and Buckley would get his revenge in round 2 by knockout. He was then given the opportunity to fight in the UFC, but it was in weird circumstances. Rising prospect Kevin Holland needed an opponent after Holland's opponent pulled out, so Buckley stepped in on short notice to take the fight. Keeping in mind that Kevin Holland for a debut opponent is a very, very dangerous task, as Holland was highly rated and on a long streak of knockouts. From the very start of the fight you could tell that Buckley was tense. Being in the UFC for the first time against an opponent who people expected him to lose to would have put a lot of pressure on Buckley, and you can see it in the way he fights. Buckley spent most of the fight out of range and punching the air, and you can sense a difference of composure between him and Holland. Holland simply moved out of the way of most of Buckley's attacks, and he caught Buckley coming in with elbows and straight punches. He'd snipe Buckley on the chin at the end of round 1 with a right cross. But Buckley would survive, get up and keep fighting. But it wasn't looking good for Buckley going into round 2, as he was clearly outmatched by the experienced Holland. Holland continued to avoid Buckley's massive wide punches and eventually put him away in round 3. With another right cross. Naturally, Buckley was disappointed by losing his debut, but realistically there's no shame in losing such a hard fight on his debut on short notice. So 2 months later he turned around against an easier opponent, Impa Kasanganay. Kasanganay was 1-0 in the UFC at the time, and we all know how this one ended. Buckley started the fight in classic Buckley fashion, throwing massive wide punches at Kasanganay, and we'd also learn about Buckley's wrestling. At this point Buckley is still quite defensively irresponsible, but you can see him get more and more comfortable in the fight compared to the Kevin Holland fight. They'd go back and forth for 2 rounds, but Buckley noticed that Kasanganay kept catching his kicks, so Buckley took advantage and did this. Such a knockout has never been seen before in the UFC, and still hasn't been seen to this day. So Joaquin Buckley, in one move, went from being the guy who got knocked out by Kevin Holland to now being an overnight sensation. Kanye West reposted the knockout on Twitter, and for a few days it was everywhere. It was on everyone's Twitter, everyone's Instagram, everyone's YouTube, everyone's Reddit, and Buckley gained an influx of new followers. So all Buckley had to do now was to maintain that momentum. Buckley was matched against Jordan Wright, who was 1-0 in the UFC at the time, and he'd knocked down Wright at the end of round 1 with a big right hand. Wright would survive to round 2, but he was clearly out of it in between rounds, so Buckley just had to finish the job. Buckley quickly noticed that Wright was circling to his wrong side, so with a big left hook, Wright went down again and the ref stopped the fight. That made Buckley 2-1 in the UFC on a 2-fight win streak with 2 knockouts. So Buckley was starting to prove himself as talented outside of that 1 knockout. So Buckley was given a big stage to perform on the undercard of McGregor vs Poirier 2, where he'd been knocked out by Alessio De Chirico in round 1 with a head kick. De Chirico was considered a bit of a layup for Buckley at the time, considering he was on a 3-fight losing streak before the fight. So that was a massive blow to Buckley's momentum. So naturally, as MMA fans are, people lost all their hope they had for Buckley and started calling him names like One Kick Wonder, saying he was only good for that 1 knockout against Kasanganay. Buckley, on the other hand, seemed to take the loss well. There were no excuses on his end, and his goal was only just to move forward and move on to the next fight. Buckley took 8 months off and then stepped in to face Antonio Arroyo in September of that year. Arroyo was definitely a layup fight for Buckley, but a necessary confidence builder for Buckley moving forward, as eventually in round 3 he'd drop Arroyo with a massive uppercut and put him away. Fans started to notice that either way, win or lose, Buckley was always putting on entertaining fights and knockouts. Buckley would take his first fight of 2022 against Abdul Razak Al Hassan. This was the first time that Buckley had fought someone in the UFC with a strong wrestling base, so it was a different type of look for Buckley. The fight was fought at a furious pace, both fighters took each other down several times across the fight, but Buckley proved that on the feet he was superior. Al Hassan spent most of the fight trying to take Buckley down to avoid the exchanges on the feet, and overall it was very competitive action throughout. Buckley would win the fight by decision ultimately, But people started to believe that maybe Buckley's weakness was other wrestlers. So as a result, the UFC matched him up with Albert Duraev. Duraev was a wrestler who'd just beaten Roman Kopylov. So as a result, Buckley was the underdog going into this fight. But people were pleasantly surprised to see Duraev struggle to get a single takedown on Buckley. So the fight was spent on the feet, where it was one-way traffic from Buckley. One of Buckley's left hands caused massive swelling on the eye of Duraev. So Buckley sensed weakness and started to go for the kill. At this point, this was Buckley's best performance. And at this point, people also started to notice Buckley was actually a talented fighter. Buckley was proven to be too physically strong to be taken down by the Russian, as Duraev continued to shoot and Buckley continued to defend the takedowns. To make matters even worse for Duraev, Buckley would knock him down with a massive left hand. So despite being favoured to win going into the fight, Duraev looked helpless and Buckley continued to work on him. Duraev would end round 2 with his back on the canvas, and before round 3, the referee and the doctors had to make a decision about whether Duraev keeps fighting with that swollen eye. The doctor stopped the fight before round 3, and Buckley was now ready for a ranked opponent. That ranked opponent would be Nassourdine Imavov in September of 2022. Imavov was not an easy task by any means, as he was also an upcoming contender with a win streak of his own. This was the first fight where the size difference really started to come into play for Buckley, as it was clear that it was a bit too small for middleweight. Imavov was the better grappler, and it was competitive action on the feet, but Imavov had the edge in the first 2 rounds. Similar to Kevin Holland, Imavov kept moving away to avoid the wide punches of Buckley and kept catching Buckley with the right cross. So by round 3, Buckley knew he needed a finish. As wild as Buckley's style is normally, Buckley had to go above and beyond to get the finish in the final round. And it seemed like the intensity of Buckley in the final round was getting to Imavov, as Imavov had a concerned look on his face, eating several wide swinging hooks from Buckley. The two started exchanging in the centre at the second half of the round, but Imavov quickly realised that was too dangerous and had to start wrestling. Imavov was too gassed to have any success in the wrestling in this part of the fight, but it was simply to keep Buckley away, as he was swinging as hard as he possibly could to take Imavov's chin off. It's rare that you see such a willingness to win in the final round, knowing that the fight is down 2 rounds. Buckley would run out of time and lose the fight by decision, but ultimately he would impress considering the effort he put in and the quality of his opponent. So despite the loss, he was given a second chance at a ranked opponent, where he fought Chris Curtis in December of 2022. Curtis was known for his counter-punching, which may be a concern for Buckley, considering how wild his style is. But Buckley actually showed quite an intelligent game plan here. He set up his attacks well from the outside and mixed it up with his kicks, which is the right way to approach a counter-puncher, but unfortunately he seemed to get overconfident as he threw a head kick from too close range and got caught for it. So all the success he had early on was erased, all down to a simple mistake. Buckley had now suffered 2 losses in a row, and he seemed to use that as a wake-up call, that he was in the wrong weight class. Buckley announced after the Curtis fight that he was moving down to welterweight, where he'd be matched up against Andre Fialho. Fialho was in a similar position to Buckley, as he'd recently lost his most recent fight, after previously being on a long win streak. Fialho would catch Buckley a few times, as I think Buckley was a bit thrown off by the speed difference of welterweights compared to middleweights. He also had some issues getting around the defence of Fialho, so he had to get creative after just using his boxing early on. At this point in his career, I think Buckley became a much more intelligent fighter. As he began to adjust mid-fight, Buckley started to use kicks a bit more, which eventually resulted in one of those kicks landing on the chin, as Fialho went down to a head kick at the end of round 2. And Buckley had an interesting way to celebrate.
Joaquin Buckley does it again!
Buckley had snapped his losing streak and had now started a streak of his own at welterweight, and he was full of life in his post-fight interview.
But he caught me though, a couple times. But bro, our recovery is good, man. Here at 170, my condition is good. That means the brain is better. You know, at 185, I was cheating myself, eating out pizza, Wendy's, McDonald's, whatever I wanted to right before the fight. This right now, I'm running mountains. I'm doing hours of work nonstop over and over again. Can't none of these boys at 170 stop me. I say nobody. You hear me? And if y'all want to pick y'all boy Fialho up, and y'all know what team I'm talking about, anybody at 170, come holler at me. Come holler at me. Pick your boy up.
His next opponent at 170 would be Alex Morono. Morono is a very simple opponent, but also very complicated at the same time because of his defence. He's a hard fighter to land clean on, so that was an interesting task for Buckley because of how wide he punches. And as such, in the first round, Buckley would really struggle to land clean. But as Buckley seems to do in every single fight nowadays, he adjusted. He started to mix in the wrestling on Morono, getting 2 takedowns in round 1 to secure the first round when it may have been up in the air before then. So in round 2, he started to use his kicks and also throw shots to the body when he wasn't doing beforehand. So now with the added threat of wrestling, kicks and body shots, Morono's defence was now more open than it was in the first round. And by round 3, Buckley was basically just walking down Morono. At this point, Buckley had started a pattern where his best round is the 3rd and final round, which is unusual for someone who throws so much into his punches and doesn't start slow whatsoever. Morono would ultimately stumble his way to the end of the 3rd round, where it'd go the distance and Buckley would win the decision. And now with a 2-fight win streak, Buckley was ready for a ranked opponent, where he'd take on the veteran Vicente Luque. Buckley was a slight underdog going into this fight, as most people seem to favour the vast experience of Luque. The first round was close and competitive, but the fight seemed to reach a turning point halfway through round 2, where Buckley stuffed a takedown and Luque fell backwards. Luque made almost no attempt to get back to his feet, so that led to Buckley simply beating the shit out of him on the ground. Some people think Luque gave up, some people think Buckley was just too strong, some people think the fight was rigged. Either way, Buckley got the stoppage in round 2, and he moved on to the top 10. Buckley, now being ranked for the first time in his career, now had to defend that ranking against Nursultan Ruziboev. Ruziboev was a tricky matchup for Buckley at this time, mainly because of his striking. He was known for his straight punches and his sniper right hand, so he was similar to Kevin Holland and Nassourdine Imavov, so that's where the issues came in. But Buckley didn't need to entertain the stand-up any longer than he needed to, as he made it a point to establish the wrestling early on. Buckley's takedowns were very well timed, usually waiting for Ruziboev to throw a knee before shooting for a double leg. In classic Buckley fashion, his best round would be round 3, as he'd rock Ruziboev with a big left hook and then follow him to the ground. He found full mount quite easily, and it almost mirrored the end of the Luque fight. He'd beat up Ruziboev until the end of the round. The fight would go the distance and Buckley would win the decision again, extending his win streak at 170 to 4, and he was now ready for an opponent in the top 10. That top 10 opponent would be Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Even in his old age, Thompson was a very skilled striker, so it was a no-brainer that Buckley had to shoot some takedowns to win the fight. Buckley got the first takedown he shot, but then struggled to get consistent takedowns across the fight, which meant he was in danger, because Wonderboy was still dangerous. So he had to start effectively mixing up the striking, which he would do. Buckley made it a point to stay away from the outside, to close the distance as much as possible, because of how dangerous Thompson's kicks are. He had to make sure Thompson was never in his ideal range. By the start of round 3, they were tied up even. Thompson took round 1, Buckley took round 2. So Buckley had to take the judges out of it, which he would do. He landed a massive right hook on the chin of Thompson and put him out. And the legendary round 3 Buckley continues to impress. And that meant it was ready for another step up in the top 5. Buckley would then be set for his first main event and first 5-round fight against Colby Covington last weekend. Colby Covington has long been one of the best wrestlers in MMA, and by far the best wrestler Buckley has fought. So it was interesting to see whether Buckley could stand up to the pressure and pace that Colby puts on people. Colby had his occasional moments, but overall it was Buckley putting the pace on Colby, and not the other way around. As Colby struggled to get any takedowns on Buckley, Colby ended round 1 on his back and with a massive cut over his eye. Colby started to get a bit more desperate for his takedowns, knowing that the cut was over his eye and the fight was in danger of being stopped. On the feet it was barely competitive. Buckley was by far the better boxer, and he seemed to hurt Colby every time he landed. Colby would continue to try his best, knowing that the fight was in danger of being stopped. But Buckley looked the best he's ever looked on the feet. He wasn't throwing too hard, he was the perfect mixture of composure and spite. Colby would eventually find his way to a takedown, but Colby's cut had opened up so bad to the point of it being a health risk. So again, in the magical round 3, Buckley would get the stoppage after the doctor waved it off. So now, after the best performance of his career, he's now on the verge of a title shot. Just one more win will guarantee him a shot, and he's eyeing up Kamaru Usman for his next fight. So overall, Buckley has improved leaps and bounds after that one big knockout back in 2020. I did not think he'd get this far, but he has. Like and subscribe, leave a comment, goodbye.